The first thing I want to do today with regard to fleecing clients and problems associated with clients is the issue of ground rents. And the first thing, if we just look at residential leases generally, is to talk about ascertaining from the lease what ground rent is payable. Where a ground rent is fixed, that's fine in my view, in that the client is aware precisely of what will be payable by way of ground rent going forward. When we come to sell or remortgage the property again, any buyer is going to be aware of what the ground rent will be going forward too. But I think there is a fundamental problem where we have ground rent review provision in residential leases. Firstly, let me explain that just because there is ground rent review provision within a lease does not make the lease defective, does not mean that the ground rent provision is onerous. It simply means that there is the potential for a ground rent going forward to be unascertainable, or for a ground rent review to be clear, but the extent of the ground rent on review such that it is untenable, unrealistic, uneconomic for a client or a future client to take such a lease. So nothing wrong with ground rent review provisions in residential leases, but it's important that we ascertain what the review date or when the review date is, and we also ascertain, if we can, what the rent will be reviewed to, if possible. So in an ideal world, I'd like the ground rent to increase every 10 years, say by 5% or 10%. In those circumstances, I, as a conveyancer for the current buyer or anyone acting on behalf of future buyers, can see exactly what the ground rent will be on review. Alarm bells begin to ring where we have, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with at the moment, situations where the lease provides for the ground rent to double, particularly where that doubling occurs at a frequency of less than 20 years. I would maintain that no matter when the ground rent doubles, it is a problematic lease on the basis that if the lease has a term of 100, 200 years or so, then the ground rent going towards the end of the term is going to be an astronomical amount of money. But most people are aware of that. If you do have a situation where a ground rent doubles at a frequency of less than 20 years, where the landlord, developer, or builder has signed up to the leasehold pledge, remember that there is a pledge that that review provision will be revised and the ground rent increase will be linked to RPI. And here's a second point, which I think is a point that isn't taken and should be taken by conveyancers, because again, it jeopardizes our client going forward. If there is a ground rent review provision in which the ground rent review is calculated by reference to retail price index, the rate of inflation, bank base rate, the ground rent is a percentage of the market value of the flat, the apartment, or property, then all of those formula, all of those matrix are unascertainable. And therefore, our client is committing to a lease and a liability within that lease that is unknown. And I think that's dangerous. Particularly given the current climate, we're talking about interest rates last year, 1.5% or so, a rate of inflation of 1%. And here we are not a year later, and we're talking about inflation at 11% and interest rates rising dramatically, sort of on a monthly basis. It's not beyond the realms of knowledge to think about rates of inflation at 15, 20%, interest rates at 15%, 20%. Such rates have been recorded in living memory.